Hello, and welcome to Armor of God Apologetics. I'm your host, Wayne Harsha. Today, we're going to be actually wrapping up our video series done for Victory Outreach Tacoma. This is my home church, and I hope you guys have enjoyed this as much as I've enjoyed putting it together and learning it. This is being co-broadcast on Zoom as well as on Facebook Live, and you can catch it on either place or both if you want to. Of course, going through Zoom gives you the opportunity to actually interact with me in person and talk through some questions. Of course, you can always leave your questions on YouTube live chat as well. So just in recap, we have had now an 8-part series. The first 4 parts were about theistic arguments, or arguments for the existence of God. And we started those theistic arguments with the cosmological argument, which is the argument from the beginning of the universe. We then moved on to the fine-tuning of the universe, or what is known as the design argument or teleological argument. And then finally, we talked about the moral argument, which, as I stated to you guys at that time, was probably what I think is the most convincing of the arguments for the existence of God. And then the last 3 previous weeks, and then today, we are talking about Jesus Christ. And so we started out by talking about, well, did Jesus Christ exist? And then we talked about the deity of Jesus, both in and outside of the Bible, both from what others said about him and about what he said about himself. And then last week, we spent a long time talking about the evidence for the death of Jesus on a Roman cross. Now, this is important tonight, because we're going to go through the resurrection of Jesus, and part of that is the minimal facts approach that we're going to use. And the first part of that is the death of Jesus on the cross. So tonight we're going to be going through, did Jesus rise bodily from the dead? And it's important that we say that, because there are some people who claim that resurrection was simply a spiritual resurrection, a soul, a spirit, rather than a bodily resurrection. But that's not what the Bible teaches. So we want to talk about what the Bible teaches. Now, like I said, we're going to be using the minimal facts approach. And the minimal facts approach is put forward in this book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. These 2 guys are by far the world's greatest resurrection experts. And Gary Habermas's career has spanned over 30 years. He was actually one of my professors at Liberty University. And if you don't read any other book on the resurrection of Jesus, this is the one you should read. And in it, he and Licona put forward what they call the minimal facts approach. And those are what they call a 4+1 approach. So 4 of these facts are that Jesus died by crucifixion, that Jesus' disciples believed that he rose bodily and appeared to them, that Paul was converted and radically changed due to his appearance of Jesus, and that James, the brother of Jesus, was also converted due to his Jesus' appearance to him in resurrected form. And then the +1 is one that is not quite as well documented, but is important to the overall argument, and that is the empty tomb. So let's get started. As we get started, I want to remind you guys of some things that we've talked about several times in the last 4 weeks. And that is what is known as historiography. So historiography is basically the study or the philosophy of history. And it sets forth some things that help historians to come to conclusions about what actually happened in history. Remember, essentially nothing can be proved from history or the study of history. What can be determined by history is the probability. And you can have things that are extremely probable all the way down to very doubtful and anywhere in between. And some of basically the 5 basic ones are that we want early testimony of an event. We want eyewitness testimony of the event. If possible, we want more than one source. And I will tell you, historians in general, when they're looking at history, they are super, super happy if they can get even 2 or perhaps at most 3 sources. And so if you get 4, 5, 6 of different sources, independent sources from a historical event, that is incredible. If an enemy attests to what is going on, then that is also considered very strong testimony. And then finally, the principle of embarrassment. So the principle of embarrassment basically says, if you are writing history, the only reason you would write something into history that is potentially embarrassing to you or your cause the more likely that is to be true. Because if you're going to write something about history, and you're going to write it from a biased standpoint, or you're going to invent part of it, you're going to invent it to make yourself look good, not to make yourself look bad. So an example of the principle of embarrassment is that Peter, the leader of the church, the rock upon which my church will be built, in Jesus' words, Peter is seen in the last day of Jesus as denying him 3 times. That's an example of the principle of embarrassment. And we'll talk about how the literature here, both biblical and extra biblical, indicates that the Bible has the principle of embarrassment, and actually all of these. Now, why are we talking about the resurrection, and why are we wrapping this all up with the resurrection? Well, I'm going to turn to 2 passages, and the first is Romans 10, 9 through 10. And it reads, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. The other one is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 13 through 17. Now, I might add, the reason that I add these 2 in here is that they are written by Paul. They are some of the undisputed letters of Paul, and they are some of the earliest works of Paul, especially 1 Corinthians. So the Corinthians passage reads like this, but if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. So notice here, Paul is saying if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, it's all in vain. In verse 15, he says, we are even found to be misrepresenting God because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. So to summarize these two passages, Paul is saying you have to believe that God raised Jesus from the dead and confess it with your heart and with your mouth. And then if he's not raised from the dead, everything we're saying is in vain. So that is how important this one single event in history is to the Christian faith. The other point I want to make here is that you need to understand that unlike many other religions, Christianity is one based in history. This is a historical event. It is an event that can be studied by history, and therefore is one that is most easily scrutinized because it centers around essentially 3 to 3.5 years of one man's life, and that is Jesus of Nazareth. It centers around his birth, his life, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection. And because of that, it opens itself up to historical criticism. And what you would find if you search the academic literature is it is the most heavily scrutinized religion in the world for that very matter. And it holds up incredibly well. So before we start talking about Jesus' resurrection, we need to find out, well, what was meant by resurrection in the ancient world? Well, the first thing I will say is this. It's a quote by N.T. Wright, who wrote this incredible book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is like 600 pages. He says, when the ancient classical world spoke of and denied resurrection, there should be no controversy about what the word and its cognates referred to. It was a coming back again into something like the same sort of life that humans presently experience. Resurrection was not one of describing what death consisted of. It was a way of describing something everyone knew did not happen. The idea that death could be reversed, undone, could, as it were, work backwards. In other words, what Wright is saying here is people at that time did not believe in a bodily resurrection. They did not believe that one could come back to life, and especially did not believe that one could come back bodily to never die again. And you may say, well, wait a minute now, Jesus raised people from the dead. Yes, he did. But there's a big difference between Jesus' bodily resurrection and him raising, for instance, Lazarus from the dead. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, Lazarus went on to die again. Jesus never did. He rose bodily and he ascended into heaven, never to die again. So there's a big difference there. And you need to understand that in Jewish theology at that time, and still today, resurrection was something that was going to happen once for everyone at the end times. It was not something that happened on an individual basis. It was not something they believed was going to happen before the end of times brought about by God. It was something that happened once for all. Once for all. Okay. Additionally, Jews at that time were not looking for the Messiah to die. That, in fact, every other Messiah, so-called Messiah that had come to be in the ancient world, when he died, the belief in him died. Okay. And they were not looking for the Messiah to be resurrected. Now, there was some contemporary Jewish scholarship at the time that believed that there would be two comings of the Messiah, but not that the Messiah would die, be resurrected to life, and then come again. And some even believe there would be two Messiahs, one on earth now, one at the end times. So you have to understand resurrection meant a bodily resurrection, and it was not something that people believed in at that time. So let's get now to this minimal facts approach. So Habermas and Lacona, in doing this minimal facts, what they're saying is not that these are minuscule facts. What they are saying is that these are facts that you don't have to believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God to understand or know. You can look at the Bible simply as a historical document. And they are saying that not only are these events strongly evidenced both biblically and extra biblically, simply from a historical standpoint, but their second criteria is that they are granted by virtually all scholars on the subject, no matter how liberal or skeptic they are. In other words, the Gerd Ludemann, who is an atheist, the Bart Ehrman, who is an agnostic leaning toward atheism, they all grant the facts of the minimal facts argument. Now, not all of them grant the empty tomb, so that's why it's the +1. But the next four facts that we're going to go over, virtually all scholarship will agree unanimously on these four facts. And what are the four facts? Well, again, fact number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number 2, Jesus' disciples truly believed that he rose and appeared to them. Notice, I'm not saying fact number 2 is that Jesus rose. Fact number 2 is that Jesus' disciples believed that he rose. Fact number 3, the church persecutor Paul was suddenly changed. The fourth fact, that the skeptic James, who was the brother of Jesus, was suddenly changed. And then that fifth fact, the +1, the presence of the empty tomb. Now, I would argue that the presence of the empty tomb is actually very well documented and that it does lend credence to the overall argument. And I'll show you how here in just a few minutes. So the first fact, Jesus died by crucifixion. We spent almost an entire hour on this last week, but I will sum it up with two quotes, both of which were from very skeptical, very liberal scholars. And the first is John Dominic Crossan, and he is the co-founder of the Jesus Seminars.
I can crank my bike up with the charger on.
One moment. And so quote number one is this. Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. For if no follower of Jesus had written anything for 100 years after his crucifixion, we would still know about him from two authors not among his supporters. Their names are Flavius Josephus and Cornelius Tacitus. Atheist Gerd Ludemann says, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Many have actually claimed that Jesus' death on the cross is the most rock solid fact of all of ancient history. The second fact then is that Jesus' disciples truly believed that he rose and appeared to them. And as support of that, we will show both that they claimed it and that they believed it. And here's how we'll do that. We'll start by talking about how they claimed it. And we'll actually start with the testimony of Paul. Now, again, why do we start with the testimony of Paul? Because, first of all, he is one of the few authors that states that he is the author of texts in the New Testament. Second of all, 7 of his letters are absolutely rock solid, indisputable that he is the author of. And in those, he gives facts about what the disciples actually claimed. Now, remember that by Paul's testimony in several of his epistles, he states that he knew the disciples Peter, James, and John. He states this in Galatians, which is one of the undisputed epistles. He also states in those that the apostles claimed that Jesus rose from the dead. And he also then is considered an independent source from the original disciples. So you got to understand, this now meets a couple of the historiographic criteria that we talked about. First of all, he wrote very early afterwards. 1 Corinthians, for instance, was written in 55 AD. Second of all, he was an enemy. So it's actually enemy attestation. And thirdly, it gives you multiple attestation in terms of historiography. Now, we also, of course, have the gospel accounts, and we have the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection, not only in the 4 gospels, but also in the sequel of the gospel of Luke, which is Acts. So we have it in all 4 of the gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, remember, Mark is considered to be the earliest of the Gospels, so we have it in the earliest Gospel. We have it in Matthew and Luke, who are felt to have borrowed some from Mark. But then we have also the independent source of John. So John and Mark and Luke and Matthew are again considered multiple attestation of the gospel message of the resurrection of Jesus. Again, in addition to that, we have even more attestation from the apostolic fathers. Many of these apostolic fathers were actually apostles of the original apostles, guys like Polycarp and Clement of Rome. So Clement of Rome lived between 30 and 100 AD. He was actually contemporary with Jesus and certainly contemporary with the original apostles. Polycarp lived between 69 and 155 AD and was said to be, in multiple pieces of literature, the disciple of John. And in both Clement of Rome and Polycarp's writing, they state that the disciples claimed that Jesus was resurrected bodily from the dead. In summarizing this, Habermas and Lacona state on page 55, the 9 sources in 3 categories above point to multiple very early and eyewitness testimonies to the disciples' claims of witnessing the risen Jesus. They also believed it, and this is virtually indisputable. You got to understand, when the disciples, first of all, when Jesus was arrested, in the gospel messages, or in the gospel accounts rather, they were afraid and they fled at the Garden of Gethsemane. Even Peter, who sort of followed Jesus into his trial, then denied Jesus 3 times. And the gospel accounts show that only John was actually present at the cross. All the rest of them were defeated, they were in fear, and they were seen as hiding, as shown in the book of Acts. Their lives were then completely transformed. You are talking about people like Peter, who went from denying Christ 3 times at his trial to going into the temple and proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. Not only that, they suffered persecution, both from the Jews and at times from the Romans. They suffered imprisonment, as shown in multiple different places, both in and outside the Bible. And some of them even suffered martyrdom, going to their graves, never having recanted what they were claiming about Jesus' resurrection. Paul also truly believed that he had experienced the risen Christ. Now, understand, Paul's description of his experience with the risen Christ are somewhat different than those of the original apostles. That can be easily explained by the fact that you need to understand the apostles, Peter, James, John, Thomas, they all experienced Jesus' resurrected body before his ascension to heaven, whereas Paul's conversion was about 2 years later, after Jesus had ascended. The same can be said of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. But Paul suffered so much for his belief and his proclamation of Jesus' resurrection. He was chained multiple times. And this is found, by the way, both in biblical and extra biblical accounts. He was chained, he was exiled, he was stoned, he was imprisoned, he was beaten, and he was even martyred in Rome at about 64 AD. Now, again, that is also attested to not only in Paul's own writings, as well as the book of Acts, which was Luke's account of what happened to the early church, but it was also documented in Polycarp's writing. Again, remember, Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle. He says that Paul, as well as the other disciples, were beaten, were chained, were imprisoned, and were even martyred. Also, Tertullian, who is an extra biblical source. Remember, Tertullian was a Roman historian. He was no friend of the Christians. He documents that both Peter and Paul went to their graves as martyrs, having been killed for their faith in the resurrected Jesus. He also spoke of other disciples being persecuted and imprisoned for their beliefs. And Josephus, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, who was the most famous of Jewish historians, also stated that the Christians were persecuted at the hands of Nero, quote unquote, as a scapegoat. Habermas sums this up by saying all of these sources, biblical and non-biblical alike, affirm the disciples' willingness to suffer and die for their faith. He also states the disciples' willingness to suffer and die for their beliefs indicates that they certainly regarded those beliefs as true. You got to understand, one of the objections is just because someone is martyred doesn't mean what they're martyred for is true. That's absolutely the case. There are Muslim martyrs, all the time as suicide bombers. There were Buddhist martyrs who protested the Vietnam War. But here's the difference. And listen to what Habermas and Licona say. Extreme acts do not validate the truth of their beliefs, but willingness to die indicates that they regarded their beliefs as true. Liars make poor martyrs. The apostles died for holding to their own testimony that they had personally seen the risen Jesus. Contemporary martyrs die for what they believe to be true. The disciples of Jesus died for what they knew to be either true or false. That's the difference between the martyrdom of the disciples and the martyrdom of, say, a modern day Muslim terrorist. And he further goes on to say there is no evidence of recantation being announced. Instead, all the reports testify to the steadfast courage during suffering of the apostles. In all, at least 7 early sources testify that the original disciples willingly suffered in defense of their beliefs. If we include the sufferings and martyrdom of Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, we have 11 sources. Remember what I said to you about multiple attestation in ancient history? Historians drool if they have even 2 or 3 sources. The martyrdom and the suffering of the disciples for their belief that they had seen the risen Jesus was documented in 11 independent sources. This is what historians' dreams are made of. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the ancient world. This is so important that atheistic New Testament scholar Gerhard Ludemann concludes it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Remember, Gerhard Ludemann is an atheist scholar, not a Christian trying to prove that Christianity is true. The third fact that we then come to is the fact that the life of the church persecutor Saul of Tarsus, or Paul, was suddenly and dramatically changed by what he claimed was an appearance and an experience with the resurrected Jesus. Remember, he started as Saul of Tarsus. Not only that, he was seen as being present at the martyrdom of the first Christian martyr, Stephen, when he was stoned for his belief. And in addition to that, he is shown and known and personally testified that he was going to Damascus to persecute and kill Christians when he had his experience. He then documents his conversion in multiple different books, in Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, and it is also documented in an independent source, which is the book of Acts, written by Luke. And remember, he had such a dramatic conversion that he is considered both the first and the greatest of all Christian evangelists. What caused this change in Paul? Habermas and Licona put it this way: both Paul himself and Luke report that it was because he believed firmly that he had experienced an encounter with the risen Jesus. Thus, Jesus' resurrection is testified to by friends and also by a foe. Therefore, we have early, multiple, and firsthand testimony that Paul converted from being a staunch opponent of Christianity to one of its greatest proponents. Paul's conversion was based on what he perceived to be a personal appearance of the risen Jesus. Now, the same is also true of the brother of Jesus, James. We know that Jesus had multiple, actually half brothers, one of which was James. What do we know about James? Well, most of what we know about James comes from the gospel accounts. And in those accounts, which are found both in Mark, 2 places in Mark, as well as in John, again, independent sources there, we see that James believed that Jesus was essentially out of his mind, that he was not being truthful, that he was crazy, if you were, for what he was preaching. And in fact, asked him to come home for what he was preaching. But then later became the leader of the Jerusalem church. Hegesippus, which by the way I just noticed is misspelled, should have an extra I in there, reports that James was by all accounts a pious Jewish man. Now, in 1 Corinthians, Paul, again, 1 Corinthians, one of the undisputed letters of Paul, Paul states that he, Jesus, appeared to James. And Acts 15 and Galatians 1 both state that James became the leader of the Jerusalem church. So we know from the gospel accounts that James was a skeptic, but then presumably because of his appearance of the risen Jesus to James, he became a staunch advocate for and leader of not just part of the church, but the church in Jerusalem. We also know that James went to his death as a martyr for his belief in the risen Jesus. And this is attested to both by Christian and non-Christian sources. So there is both early and eyewitness and multiple attestation of the conversion of James and his ultimate martyrdom for what he believed was an appearance of the resurrected Jesus to him. Now, the fifth fact, and I know it seems like we're going through these kind of quick, but I'm going to put it all together for you in just a moment. The fifth fact, which actually is really important when it comes to the counter arguments to the objections to the risen Jesus, the empty tomb is very important. Now, it does not quite meet the criteria that Habermas and Licona put out for the minimal facts. Not because it's not strongly evidenced, but more because there's only about 75% of academic scholarship that holds to the empty tomb. So it doesn't meet that criteria that is granted by virtually all scholars. Now, there are three things we need to understand about the empty tomb and why it is important to us. The first is the Jerusalem factor. Remember, it was not as if Jesus was tried and hanged hanged on a cross in one place and then was said to have resurrected in another place. He was said to have resurrected, and he was preached to be resurrected in Jerusalem. So Jesus was tried, punished, crucified, resurrected, and then had his resurrection preached all in the same location. And what is the one fact that could have killed the entire movement? Producing the body of Jesus. All any of his enemies ever had to do was go to a tomb and produce the body of Jesus. But nowhere do we see that that was even attempted. Furthermore, the empty tomb is actually attested to by enemies. And you may say, well, wait a minute, it's in the Bible. Yes, it is, but it is attested to by the Jewish segment in the Bible. It's an interesting if you stop and think about that story. It is said that the soldiers at the tomb realized that the body was gone, and they went not to Pontius Pilate, by the way, but they went to the Jewish leaders. And they said to the Jewish leaders, we were asleep and someone stole the body. And the Jewish leaders said, tell them, paid them actually, said, tell them if anyone asks that while you were sleeping, the disciples came and stole the body. Now, how would you know who stole the body if you were sleeping when it happened? So it's kind of an odd thing, but it is enemy attestation nonetheless. The third thing about the empty tomb is the testimony of women. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Now, again, the Jerusalem factor. He was condemned, beaten, and crucified all in the same city. He then resurrected in that city by the testimony of the book of Acts. And again, anything but an empty tomb would have been devastating to the resurrection account. Now, the other thing that we talk about in terms of the enemy attestation is that even though there was every opportunity for either the Romans or the Jews to come up with other explanations, you don't see that. There is nothing in ancient literature that indicates any other competing explanation for the empty tomb. None. There's no written documentation of anything else happening except the gospel accounts that say that the Jews conspired with the guards to say that the tomb was empty because the disciples of Jesus had stolen the body. Now, the testimony of women is a very interesting thing. First of all, it's used a lot by skeptics to try to say that the gospel accounts are contradictory. And I would argue that's absolutely not the case. Remember, contradictory means this. Contradictory is one gospel saying Jesus raised from the dead. The other gospel says Jesus did not raise from the dead. Or one gospel says only women went to the tomb, and the other gospel says no women went to the tomb. That is a contradiction. Now, it is true that one of the accounts says there was one woman. One of the accounts names several. Another account named several more. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been in groups before where when later on someone asked me, hey, who was there in this group at the cafeteria, let's say? I'll say, oh, it was John and Jane. But in reality, there were 15 or 20 people there. It doesn't mean there weren't other people there. It simply means those were the most prominent people that I interacted with. And that's true of the gospel accounts. Now, let's move on a little bit and talk about the women being the eyewitnesses. You have to understand that both in Roman and Jewish culture, the testimony of women held much less esteem. In fact, in the Old Testament, it was said that you needed two women basically to account for the same as one man. And this is even seen in the gospel accounts. What do I mean by that? Well, what does it say that the men did when the women came back and reported that the tomb was empty? They didn't believe. Okay. Now that gives you, by the way, the criteria of embarrassment right there in two ways. Number one, the women were the first ones to have discovered it. Remember, Jesus had predicted his own resurrection. So if the apostles had wanted to paint themselves in a good light, they would have said, oh, wait a minute. He died, but he said he was going to come back on the third day. Let's all go to the tomb on the third day. But what do we see? All of the guys were sitting back in the upper room, moping around, upset that Jesus had been crucified. It was the women who went to take care of the body, and they're the ones that found it. So you have the principle of embarrassment that the women found it, and that the disciples hadn't believed Jesus. Furthermore, there's even more embarrassment in that they didn't believe the women either. So again, it fulfills the criterion of embarrassment. So I think that the empty tomb is a very solid fact. And again, even 75% or so of scholars, including skeptical scholars, will grant the empty tomb. So how do we put all this together? Well, we're going to do that by looking at the testimony of Paul. Again, why? Well, as Gary Habermas puts it, Paul is the skeptic's darling. And if you don't use facts from Paul's writings, skeptical scholars will. They will go to the Bible and they will use Paul's epistles as historical documents, and they will point to them. He's also a convert, so he originally was an enemy of the way. And by his writings, you can tell that Paul was a heck of a scholar. All you have to do is read Romans, and you understand that Paul was a scholar. Not only that, he states that he was a scholar. He was a Pharisee, which meant he was a very learned man. He had studied under one of the greatest teachers, Gamaliel. And all you have to do is look at some of his writings to see he was a heck of a philosopher as well. Look at the description of him in Acts 17, where he went to the Areopagus in Athens, and that'll show you that he was an excellent philosopher as well. He was also in the right place at the right time. As a Pharisee, he was in Jerusalem at this time. He went back to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion, and again 14 years later, and he knew the other disciples. Again, either 6 or 7, depending on how you count it, are considered undisputable, authentic letters of Paul, even by skeptics. That's Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and then Philemon. Now, Philemon is kind of not that big of a deal because it's a pastoral letter and it's only 1 chapter long and doesn't really have much in the way of theology in it. We're going to concentrate only on 2 texts. I'm actually going to start with the second one first and then go to the first one. The second one is the end of Galatians 1 and beginning of Galatians 2. And I'm going to read it for you, and I want you to listen very carefully for some of the key points here. Paul writes, for I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. This is important. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, Peter, and remained with him for 15 days. Even Bart Ehrman, by the way, says, I wish I had 15 days with Peter. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the region of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only were hearing it said, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy, and they glorified God because of me. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I had proclaimed among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. What is he saying here? He's saying, I talked to the leaders in Jerusalem to find out whether I was preaching what I was supposed to be preaching. And he then goes on to say, but even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. That part's not as important. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery. To them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. So what is he saying here? He's saying after 14 years of me preaching, I went back to Jerusalem. I met with the leaders of the Jerusalem church and made sure that the gospel I was preaching was the same gospel they were preaching, and they added nothing to me. So in other words, he was claiming the exact same thing as the original apostles had claimed. Now, let's move on to 1 Corinthians 15. And I'm not going to make you read it in Greek because I can't read it in Greek. But here he's talking about the resurrection of Christ. And this is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I received. So Paul is saying, I gave you the most important stuff. And here it is, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he also appeared to me. So here's the summary of what Paul is saying. He's saying, when I came to Corinth, I preached the gospel message. And here it is. I gave you what I was given. And what I was given is that Jesus died, that he was buried, and that he rose on the third day. That is the gospel message. The life, death, burial, resurrection, and deity of Jesus is the base of the gospel message. And he said that was of utmost importance to you. Now, he also says something very important about the appearances, and that is that there were 3 individuals and 3 groups that he appeared to. The first is Peter or Cephas. The second is James, the brother of Jesus. The third was Paul himself. Furthermore, and this is really important, he appeared to the 12. Now remember, by this point, Judas Iscariot had killed himself, and Matthias had replaced him. So there were still 12. So he appeared to the 12. Then he appeared to 500 of the brothers. Now, remember, in a similar manner to the feeding 5,000, that was 5,000 men. So when it says 500 of the brothers, if there were women present, which there very possibly were, that could have actually been more than 500 people. But we know it's at least 500. And what does Paul say about these 500? Well, it's almost like he's begging you to go ask them. He's saying, many of them are still alive. Why don't you go find out? They're all around. We're all right here. If you really want to know, go ask them. Because he even says only a few of them have died at that point. And then, quote, all the apostles. And it's a little less clear what he actually means by all the apostles. Okay. It's also important, this little bit about I gave you what I was given. This is where recent scholarship has really changed the whole game. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was very rare for scholars to believe the things that Gary Habermas and Mike Licona have put out to you. But now, as evidenced by what they say, the minimal facts approach is based on what virtually every academic scholar will tell you. What changed? Much of it was this, that it was an early creedal tradition. We have our creeds now, things like the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ. And if you notice by that, they're very poetic. They're kind of sing-songy. And you can understand that in the Greek, this reads da 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 da. Okay, so it's clear that it is a poetic creedal statement. Why? Well, in large part, and why did it have? It doesn't rhyme, by the way, in Greek, but it does have that rhythm, that bounce to it. Why is that important? Remember, these were folks who, by and large, were illiterate. And if you want them to remember important things, what do? You put it to a rhythm. Think about it. How much easier is it to remember a song or a rhyming poem than it is to just remember a bunch of historical facts? It also indicates that this was some of the earliest preaching. And even the skeptic scholar, Bart Ehrman, says we can trace this material to within 1 year after the cross. And if you don't think that's early, I can tell you of all kinds of historical figures that we don't have anything for hundreds of years afterwards. So to say that we have an early creedal tradition that goes back to within 1 year of the cross is unheard of in ancient literature. Let's trace this out. So first of all, the cross, the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection on the third day happened, most believe, in 30 AD. Okay, some believe 33, depends on which calendar you use. We're going to go with 30 just to keep it consistent. So 30 AD. Now we've just been talking about 1 Corinthians. When was 1 Corinthians written? It was written in about 55 AD. And we know this because it came after about 3 to 4 years after Paul had been in Corinth. Well, one of the most solid dates that we have in the entire New Testament is when Paul first went to Corinth. We know that this was in 51, perhaps early 52 AD. How do we know that? Well, in the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul names one of the leaders of the city-state of Corinth. And we know from historical documents that these leaders were elected for 1 year periods of time. This particular leader, we know from their documentation, ruled between 51 and 52 AD. So again, this is probably the most solid fact in terms of timing in all of the New Testament. Now, in addition to that, we then have that we know from documentation that Paul's conversion was in about 32 AD. So about 2 years post Jesus' resurrection. Okay. Now, remember what he said in Galatians. He said, I didn't go right to Jerusalem. I went out into the desert and then for 3 years, and then I came to Jerusalem. And at that point, I spent 15 days with Peter and James. So we know that's in 35 AD. That's now 5 years post resurrection. He says there that he says in his letter to the Corinthians, I gave you what I received. Where did he receive that? Well, he received that no later than in 35 AD. And we know this because he already had it throughout his first 14 years of ministry after that. Because he says again in Galatians, I went back to Jerusalem 14 years later, or in 49 AD, 2 years before he entered Corinth. He went back to Jerusalem and he sat with the leaders of the church. And remember, how does that passage in Galatians end? They added nothing to me. So the preaching that he gave the Corinthians that he received was that he received in 35 AD. Well, that means Peter and James had it before that. And remember, it had to have been codified even before that. And that is how Bart Ehrman states we can trace this material to within 1 year after the cross. Hurtado, who recently retired from Edinburgh, said that the death, deity, resurrection, and faith about that can be traced all the way back to within 6 months of the cross. And James D.G. Dunn states, the latest this creed was put together was 6 months after the cross. This is as early as it gets in all of antiquity. Now that we've gone through all those facts and kind of wrapped them all in a package, let's look at some of the objections. Because sometimes it's easiest to put these things together by dealing with the greatest objections that come against it. Well, the first one is the apparent death theory. First of all, this is very recent in history. It is in part, it was first put out probably actually by Muslims because it states in Surah 4, 157 that he was neither crucified nor did he die. So in other words, it's an apparent death. Okay. Now, let's think about the nature of his injuries as we talked about last week. Remember, many people actually died during scourging. And Jesus clearly was so weakened by it that he could not even carry the roughly 120-pound patibulum on his back up to Golgotha to be crucified. So he was in extremely poor condition before that. Not only that, we know from all documents, both biblical and extra biblical, that Jesus died on the cross, first of all. And second of all, we know about the nature of crucifixion. In fact, we know that only one person in antiquity is ever known to have quote unquote survived crucifixion. And he was actually one of 3 who were taken off of the cross, knowingly being alive at the time. Also, the book of John describes something that was described in extra biblical literature as well, which is that a spear pierced his side, causing a flow of blood and water. We also know that Roman soldiers, remember we talked about this last week, the Roman soldiers who crucified people, predominantly Jews, were a team of 5, a centurion and 4 soldiers, and they were specific teams, specially trained in crucifixion. They were trained killers. Next of all, he was buried in linen burial cloths and with spices and ointments. And we know that these weighed almost 100 pounds. So in an apparent death theory, the whole concept is that he was brought down off the cross, having basically passed out, that neither the Roman guards nor the people who were there, nor the ones who buried him realized he was still alive, and that he then took off these 100 pounds of ointments and linen cloths and rolled away a stone, quote unquote, coming back to life. Again, the enemy attestation was also that he had died. Remember, it's shown in the Bible that that before he was able to be buried by Joseph of Arimathea, they actually went to Pilate, and Pilate said, "Make sure he's dead first," which is why the spear was pierced into his side. Furthermore, after all of that, they expect that Jesus would have rolled away a stone from the front of the tomb. Now, understand that these stones were in one of two fashions. They were either square or rectangular and were fit into basically a trough, or more commonly, they were on a slight ramp and they were rolled downhill into basically a little dugout area so they would stay in place. Furthermore, it is documented that his was sealed, meaning there were ropes put across it and mudded to it so that they would know that no one had tampered with it. Now, these stones were sometimes up to 1,000 or more pounds. Now, remember, the whole theory here is that Jesus was passed out and was put in a tomb, not knowing that the tomb was guarded. So somehow he supposedly rolled this stone back up a ramp that weighed 1,000 pounds. This is a man who wasn't strong enough to carry a 125-pound patibulum on his back. He somehow now rolls a 500 to 2,000-pound stone up a ramp and does it quietly enough that the guards outside didn't know it. You see the problems we're already dealing with here? In addition to that, he's described in the Gospels as having then walked to Emmaus. Now, Emmaus is not 500 feet outside the gate of Jerusalem. Emmaus is actually a 7-mile walk, and he is described as having gone all the way to Emmaus with them. Furthermore, if you took a man and scourged him and beat him and put a crown of thorns on his head and then put him in a tomb for 3 days, I might add, by the way, 3 days is about the most anyone can go without food or water. Water rather, they will die of dehydration. And you expect that he came out of the tomb and somehow the disciples thought that that bruised, beaten, battered, stabbed man was a resurrected, alive again person? This just doesn't seem logical. What about the theft theory? Well, first of all, it's obviously the oldest theory. It's the only one actually put forward in the Bible. And it comes actually in two forms. So the first form is actually that the disciples stole the body. Now, obviously, that is the one put forward in the Bible. Now, again, let's think about that story. The Jews conspired with the soldiers at the tomb to tell people that while they were sleeping, the disciples stole the body. Again, think about the problem with that. How would you know who stole the body if you were sleeping and they stole the body out from underneath your nose? It's not a logical statement anyway, but that's the oldest one. The other is that someone else stole the body. Now we see this in Matthew 28, and I won't read this for you because we're getting a little bit long on time. But the problems with that theory is this. First of all, conspiracies fall apart. What they are saying is that the disciples conspired to steal the body. But anytime you then put heat on conspiracies, someone is going to crumble. And you're talking about, at a minimum, 12 people, 11 really, but at a minimum 11 men, plus all the women who were present as well. They conspired to steal the body. Conspiracies like that fall apart. Again, it was the resurrection that convinced the disciples, not the empty tomb. Remember, the only one that realized what the empty tomb meant in any of the gospel accounts was the Apostle John. No one else really understood what that meant. They walked away dazed and amazed and confused. Also, you have to understand that you're trying to convince me that these disciples who ran away, denied Jesus, were so scared they weren't even at the cross, now got up the courage and the intestinal fortitude to go get past guards, which is a problem in and of itself, and steal the body out from under their nose. It doesn't fit. The story doesn't make sense. And it doesn't explain the conversion of Paul, who was against the church, and of James, who was a skeptic. Finally, again, resurrection was not expected. It wasn't expected by anybody in the time, either Roman or Jew, and it was shown in several of the accounts of Jesus predicting his resurrection that they didn't understand what he was saying. So if they didn't understand what he was saying, why would they then come up with this theory to go back and steal the body? It just simply doesn't make sense. The next theory is the hallucination theory. And understand, the hallucination theory is built on the fact that these people believe there is no supernatural. So they think it had to be something in their minds. First of all, what we need to do is define what a hallucination is. And I'll read to you what they call it, how they define it in Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Excellent book, by the way, excellent chapter on the resurrection. A hallucination can be defined as a conscious sensory experience that occurs in the absence of corresponding external stimulation of the relevant sensory organ. In other words, if you see it, there's not actually something there to see. If you hear it, there's not actually a sound. And has a sufficient sense of reality to resemble a veridical perception. In other words, to resemble a true thing or a true event. Here are the problems with the hallucination theory. First of all, not only did multiple people claim to see Jesus resurrected, groups claimed to see Jesus resurrected at the same time. Remember, who did he appear to? He appeared to 3 individuals and 3 groups. He appeared to Cephas, he appeared to James, he appeared to Paul. And then the 3 groups, the 12, 500 brothers, and all the apostles. Groups don't experience mass hallucination. There is no evidence for it anywhere in the medical literature or anywhere else in history. Period. End of discussion. Furthermore, there were multiple appearances over a 40-day period of time that Jesus resurrected and was seen. This again doesn't fit with hallucinations. Furthermore, most people who experience hallucinations, such as bereaved spouses, they will experience it from time to time, but it is typically someone like a deceased loved one coming to them, either in appearance or in sound. But it is described that they not only talked back and forth with Jesus, but that they ate with him and that they touched him. You can't touch a hallucination. Also, the hallucination theory doesn't explain the empty tomb. Remember, what could have killed all of this is them producing the body. All they had to do was produce the body, and they didn't. And it also, the hallucination theory, some would claim, well, bereavement is what caused their hallucination and all that kind of stuff, but that doesn't explain Paul's conversion, and it doesn't explain James' conversion. What about the wrong tomb theory? Well, basically that theory is, well, the women and all of them went to the wrong tomb. Well, first of all, it doesn't make a lot of sense because the women were described as being present at the tomb when he was buried. Second of all, he was buried in a known tomb of a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea, and he was buried in part by Nicodemus, one of the Pharisees. So had they gone to the wrong tomb, all Joseph and Nicodemus would have to say is, hey, you guys went to the wrong tomb. He's right here. Again, would have been very easy. You guys were at the wrong tomb. Go to this tomb. You see Jesus' body. End of the whole discussion. So what are the problems? Whoops, sorry. Multiple people claim to see Jesus resurrected. Sorry, went back too far. It was the resurrection that convinced the disciples, not the empty tomb. The empty tomb convinced no one but John. It doesn't explain the conversion of Paul or James. There are no sources to support the wrong tomb theory, and evidence suggests that the location was known. So, in basic conclusion here, I'm going to go back to one of the first verses I ever gave you. and that is 1 Peter 3:15 and 16. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. And at that, I'm going to thank you for your time, for your support, for your attention. And I'm going to give you my resources. My resources, like I said, if you read no other book on the resurrection, read this one, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. I would also highly, highly recommend The Evidence That Demands a Verdict by McDowell and McDowell. And if you're really into academic readership, or academic literature rather, I would recommend these two books, and that is The Resurrection of the Son of God by N.T. Wright and The Resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographic approach by Habermas's co-author, Mike Licona. These are incredible books. These two, however, as you can see, much bigger and a lot more technical. So I hope that you have gained something from this. I pray that this would have blessed your life. Also, by the way, Gary Habermas's website is excellent. He lets you download anything you want from it. And at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions. Does anybody have any questions for me? All right. Well, I guess that probably means one of two things. Either I bored you all to death, or hopefully that I actually did a decent job in doing this. So anyway, I again thank everybody for having watched this series and participated with me. So.
The class was absolutely great. I would definitely put this on a replay. I enjoyed a lot of the little nuggets, everything from the a man who could barely carry the cross to all of a sudden mustering up straight. Like all those little things were heavy. Even like just a lot of nuggets, like the Apostle Paul. I gave you what was given to me. Like I was getting revelation. Like even like for direction for life in the church. Like I'm not called to give a strategy or a theory. I'm called to give what was given to me, and that was the death and resurrection. Right? The life and the death and resurrection of Christ. So just a lot of Rima words for myself, but great class.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to comment, man. Overall, it's really enjoyable, but there was something that you had mentioned about Paul, where he actually went to the elders, man, to make sure that the gospel that he was preaching was the right gospel. And I was really thinking, I'm like, dang, that's a good question. Is the gospel that I preach, not only through the Bible, but also with my life, is it the same gospel that they preached? And so that really got my mind thinking, bro. And it's like, I think it's challenging me to study more, man. And so I want to thank you for that, bro, because that was phenomenal, man. I needed that. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Ever.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, I do want to put is there another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about, do you have any more information on Jesus talking to James privately?
So there's not much literature there, actually. That's a great question. In fact, most of what we know about the appearance of Jesus to James is actually from Paul. Okay. And so there's really not much else there. Now, there are some extra canonical gospels, some of the so-called pseudo gospels and things of that sort that talk more about it. The problem with those are they're mostly Gnostic, and they are they come from way after, hundreds of years later, 200, 300, 400 AD. And it's interesting. Habermas actually makes a statement about the fact that that, you know, people say, well, why was the original church so selective in what gospels that they chose for the Bible? And his statement was, well, it's not their fault that there were only 4 available at the time. You know, the rest came later. And so if you look at those, the problem with those extra canonical gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas is one that's commonly stated. In fact, the Jesus Seminar, which I've talked about a couple of times, they actually even use the Gospel of Thomas. Now, it's a little ridiculous that they did, because it's been clearly documented that it was from a couple hundred years after Christ. But there's clearly legend in a lot of those. Like the Gospel of Peter, for instance, it talks about, you know, the cross coming out and being, you know, hundreds of feet high, and all the things that are clearly mythological additions. And so you can't take much out of those, unfortunately.
Right.
And because of that, we really don't have much literature that's verifiable and that is, you know, useful for us in terms of the appearances of Jesus to James.
The same goes for the Maccabees too, right?
Correct. Yep. All right. I do want to give a little plug about what I'm going to be doing next. So I'm going to actually be doing what I'm now going to call 6-minute Sundays. And I actually have to give props to my son, Wyatt. He's the one who gave me the idea for the name. But basically, the reason I went into apologetics, and something I mentioned in the first segment that we did, was that about 70% of young people leave the church. And part of that is because when they get out into the world or out into college, they're faced with a lot of very skeptical professors and things of that sort, and it makes them start doubting because they've never been taught the hard things or had the hard questions answered. And if you talk to a lot of atheists who were once believers, they will tell you, well, I started doubting because I asked questions and people would tell me, oh, there is no answer. You just got to believe. And so I want to get back to that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take questions from teens and young adults. And I want the hardest questions. And I'm going to interview these teens, and I'm going to then answer their questions. And I'm gonna put those up as videos. And I'll actually give you what one of the first questions I thought was an excellent question. So my son sent me this question. He said, how do you know if God is working in your life? Another question, does God have favorites? Another, is there a limit on how many times God will forgive you, or if he doesn't forgive some things? Does God take revenge if you've done something bad? Is the devil ever more prominent in your life, trying to make you suffer more than God tried to help you? So you can see these are tough questions. This is coming from a 14-year-old young man. And these are the kind of questions that I'm going to start answering in 6-minute Sundays. So I hope that you will join me in that. And if you have any questions that you want answered like that, once I get through some of the teens questions, I can answer some of the adult questions. So you can always send those to me as well. So anyway, thank you all very much. And if I don't have any other questions, I guess I'll be ending the live stream.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you, Sister Jessica. Y'all have a good one now.
Thank you. Have a good night.
All right.
You
Night,
too.
guys.
Bye, everybody.